Okay. So both Mark and Joe were here last week, but basically it was just looking at the Northern Light wiring, then talking a little bit about trying to figure out power draw so that people could size up their systems. Then just thinking through the upgrade. So what is it you want to power? What are some of your usage patterns? You know, what kind of appliances are you using? What kind of driving habits do you have so you can be generating power off your alternator? You know, how often do you pull into RV parks so that you could take advantage of shore power? And then this is just an example of me putting out my requirements. And then once I figured out my upgrade plan, seeing whether I was meeting all my requirements for boondocking in the winter, which is kind of Laurent's challenge too, versus in the summer where even with a small amount of solar, you could be generating a tremendous amount of power and be running a surplus. Charger right sizing, so just putting in enough to charge things to the rates that you need, but not necessarily overbuilding. And then I think based on comments on the last meeting, I went ahead and added a slide, and I'll publish these to the Northern Light groups here pretty quick, just explaining flooded lead acid and AGM and golf cart batteries. And that, for a lot of us, we're looking at lithium, but we're looking at that lithium iron phosphate formulation in particular. That's the thing that's excited, although there are some new formulations coming down the road that are also exciting and may overtake lithium iron phosphate. So I thought where I would start today is I threw this slide together just to talk about flooded lead acid battery charging versus lithium. And, first, the basic sequence is chargers are pushing voltage at your batteries. And then, of course, as it pushes it down, typically very long wires, there's some voltage drop that occurs. But, when it comes to pushing the voltage and what pops out at the other end of your battery, with flooded lead acid batteries, they get their chemistry going and they start their charging process when you can manage to push about 12.6 volts to them. Battery University says it's 12.6 plus or minus 0.3 volts. So it's not exactly the same for all flooded lead acid batteries. But you need to hit this 12.6 volts in general to start a lead acid battery charging. And then as you progressively manage to get more volts to the battery, maybe at 13, you get more charging occur, but you still run the risk that with a lead acid battery, it won't achieve a full charge. Instead, it will kind of stall out at its charge. And for lead acid, you really need to be pushing up around 13.6 volts to ensure that you'll top off a lead acid battery. So that's lead acid. Obviously, if you push too much, you get to a point where you're damaging the lead plates and the sulfuric acid is starting to boil off. The trick with lithium batteries is that the charging process doesn't really start until 13.6 volts. That's when the ions start flowing and minor charging starts. And if you're just at 13.6 volts, which is where a typical lead acid charger would leave off, if you're trying to push this into a lithium battery, you're just not going to reach 100% stated charge. So it's going to be slow charging and you're not going to top the battery off. And based on data from Progressive Dynamics Inc. and some other companies, when they see people connecting lithium batteries to their lead acid chargers that top out at 13.6, they're claiming a lot of these people, besides getting slower charger, are typically topping out at about 70 to 90% stated charge. And so that's why lithium chargers are important, because they'll push the voltage up to 14.4 to 14.6 volts. And so this will speed the charging process for lithium batteries, really drive them at the rate that they can handle. And you'll also make sure that you hit the 100% stated charge. And then for batteries that have the built-in cell balancing, it's important to get up in this range because then that activates some of the cell balancing activity that is healthy for the lithium batteries. So if you're only getting to 13.6 or like 13.9, you may not trigger some of that important cell balancing activity. So any questions there?
I have a question, Tom, and thanks
Yeah.
for doing this as well.
Yeah, you bet. I'm having fun.
So, a good quality charger has different profiles for the batteries, right?
Correct.
And are you saying that you would recommend, or your sources would recommend a dedicated charger for lithium ion, or
No,
just changing the profile?
yeah, just making sure that you have that profile.
Yeah.
And so as we talked about before, the original Progressive Dynamics Shore charger that Northern Light was installing, it only had the flooded lead acid and gel modes in it. It didn't have this lithium mode in it.
Yeah.
But the newer ones have that lithium mode. And oh, as a matter of fact, I'll point out that just last week, my Battleborns were sitting at about 30% stated charge, and it's 200 amp hours. When the PDI was running in flooded lead acid mode, outputting 13.6 volts, the charge rate was only 4 amps. Now I could use that little pendant and I could hit the boost button, which would cause the voltage to jump up to 14.4. Then it was suddenly those batteries were pulling 38 amps. And so by just having the right mode on the charger, the charge rate was 10x.
Yeah, and so I have a 2018, and the original solar charger on that was also not tuned for lithium ion. So
yeah,
I had to abandon that.
And although I do think that the Enerwatt, I was reading the specs for it and it talked about it did have some sort of boost mode. So I wasn't sure if that occasionally it could push a little higher, but
Yeah.
but it wasn't a dedicated lithium mode. So I'd say at best it was a gimmick that might help a little bit, but not help enough.
Yeah, now I'm in the quandary of a lot of people that still want to know what to do with that space. Currently, the old unit is just sitting there, dumb as can be, but it fills up the hole. So
yeah. And this was an example of, I ran this voltage drop calculator. This is a real nice one. And be advised when you use this voltage drop calculator, it uses one-way wiring distance. So it's assuming that you're running negative and positive wires together at the same length. And so when you say 25 feet in this calculator, it's really 50 feet of wire. If you look at it, 25 of positive and 25 of negative. So as you look at the different calculators, you have to make sure that, which ones are one way when you type in the distance versus two-way. But what this was showing is if you have an alternator that's putting out 14.4 volts, and let's say your wire is 50 feet in length, and you try to put an 18 amp load on that wire, your voltage is going to drop down to 12.6 volts. And that's the bare bones that you need to start lead acid charging. So this is a simple way of just saying, for sure, if you have an alternator like this and this amount of wire, there's no way that you can exceed 18 amps worth of charging with a flooded lead acid battery. And of course, as we're seeing most users report, they're only getting 5 to 10 amps coming over their 7-pin setups. And I don't know about all of you, but I did crawl around on my truck. I looked at my umbilical cord and I looked in the camper. And it's really easy to imagine that there's about 50 feet of 10 gauge wire one way. It's kind of depressing to see that length, but it is what it is. What the second thing was doing is, imagine your goal is to at least hit that 13.6 volts minimum that you need to start charging lithium batteries, but you had your same 10 gauge wire setup. Basically, when you run the voltage drop calculator, if you're putting an 8 amp load on this length of wire, at 8 amps, you're going to be seeing 13.6 volts coming off the end of the wire. And we know that this is the point at which lithium just barely starts charging. So in a roundabout way, it's basically saying, with a traditional 7-pin setup, we're basically going to limit our ability to charge things to, it has to be less than 8 amps by definition. And this is where I take issue with the idea that lithium batteries are drop-in replacement. You can drop them in, they won't blow up. But the charge rate is just going to be really, really low. And especially at 13.6 volts. Well, actually, as you start to charge it, trickle charge it really slow, the load it's going to put on the wire is going to decrease. So the voltage is going to drift up. But basically, it's going to be painfully slow charging. And then this was just an example of assuming that the wire length was the same, but if you were to upgrade to 4-gauge wires, then chances are you could start to get into maybe the 32 amp realm for lithium batteries, which, especially for a 2-battery bank, that's still pretty slow charging.
Yeah, so I did 2-gauge, and I have about, it's closer to about 30, 35 feet. And
okay.
Like I said, with that Renogy charger on there, I do see 52 amps at times.
Yeah, great.
It'll pull in, but then it seems to kind of like to be at around 38, 40, and then at the end it'll even drop less. But initially it'll charge pretty quickly at 52 amps.
Great. Well, and that's the intent of the DC to DC chargers, is they're kind of like acting like a transmission between what your alternator and your wiring can deliver and then what your batteries really want to see in the way of charging rate. And so it can, as the voltage drops, it can basically put a little additional amperage load on the wire and then trade that additional amperage to get more volts on the other side.
So I looked ahead a little bit, not to spoil anything, but you do have a slide in there about the Renogy, and you chose not to use it.
Yeah.
So are you going to get to that today, you think?
Oh, yeah. As a matter of fact, that's just 2 or 3 slides away.
All right, fine. We'll wait.
Yeah.
So quick question, Tom, when you're making those distance calculations for the wire run,
Yes,
you're including the full round trip, right? Positive terminal to the, and the return path, the negative to the negative, right?
Yeah, for this calculator, they're assuming that you're running equal lengths of positive and negative. And so it's 50 feet one way, it's 100 feet round trip.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. A point of frustration, I was just looking at the Renogy charger manual today, and then I've, of course, have seen the Sterling one. I get frustrated when they talk about distance because they don't clarify in the manuals for the DC to DC chargers. Are they talking about one-way or two-way distance? And it obviously makes a difference.
I found the manuals and the tech support to be very, very bad with Renogy.
It's kind of a consumer RV level, not really. Yeah, I mean, you don't see that equipment in ambulances and fire trucks and stuff like that, right? That critical uses, right?
That particular one is really new from what I understood. When I bought it, it had only been on the market for 5 or 6 months. So, this is the combination DC-DC solar, and I probably wouldn't buy it again.
Okay. Well, we'll get there in another slide or two.
Yeah.
So just for your benefit, someone had posted the Dragonfly specs. And by the way, Dragonfly and Battleborn, it's the same company. I think Dragonfly is actually the shell parent company of Battleborn. And I think when Battleborn batteries get sold in other parts of the world, they're referred to as Dragonfly batteries. But someone managed to get their hand on this really awesome table that shows the resting voltages at various states of charge, and then where the voltages go in relation to amps of load and charging. And so from this table, I went ahead and just for my own benefit, I'm going to tape this somewhere in my camper. I created this little table, so feel free to steal this little diagram. And so if
you did the colored ones?
yeah, I did the color coding.
Nice.
And in general, especially with Victron, they seem to say it's good to cut off the lithium batteries when the state of charge drops below 20%. So that's why I thought color coding things below 20% as yellow was reasonable for lithium. You can definitely go down into this range, but and then obviously at 0, you just don't want to go there. The battery the BMS will protect you there. And then because they gave the weird 17, 14, 9%, that's not the way they do the flooded lead acid charts, but so I just tried to approximate so that you could have a comparison with flooded lead acid. So a table for your benefit. Let me see, is there? No, that's it. And then I shared this out to Laurent. So Laurent was using this to start programming some of his setup, but I went out and tracked down for the chargers, the Victron chargers, and for the Victron battery meter. I went down and I tracked the specs down from Victron, Battleborn, and AM Solar for how they would set things. And so as you go through like the Victron solar controller, here are the settings that I'm using. And then in the parens, I've basically said, for like absorption voltage, I'm setting it 14.5. Victron was recommending 14.2, Battleborn 14.6, although Battleborn said this range is acceptable, and AM Solar was recommending 14.4. So I've tried to lay out my homework and what I was finding and share that out. And then I was just taking an average of a lot of what they were recommending, and that's what I've started with. So wiring options explored. So we're all familiar with this. This is the way the Northern Light comes by default. Shore AC coming into the AC distribution, then the 45 amp AC to DC converter, and then the DC distribution panel pushing power out to all the DC devices. And near as I can tell in this setup, the AC to DC converter, when it was trying to charge my 2 lead acid batteries, I was getting about 18 amps worth of charging over 10 gauge wires, which is what Northern Light installs. And then for the truck path, that's through the 7-pin 10 gauge wires typically. And I figured I was getting 5, maybe 10 amps flowing through that to the battery. And then at least in 2018, it was just a single 100 watt solar panel on top, and then going through the Enter Watt solar charger, which had lead acid and gel modes, but not that lithium mode. And I never measured it, but theoretically, it's just 0 to 6 amps total capacity being shoved into the batteries.
Yeah, that's all I see. Sometimes 7-ish.
Oh, really?
With the single panel.
Okay.
But not with the Enter Watt. That's with the Renogy.
Yeah.
I'm further south than you guys.
Yeah, I'm envious, especially now.
Not much.
And then I don't know much about it, but it looks like Northern Light just shifted over to these Armada solar chargers. Looks like the ARC 30 unit. And so it adds the lithium mode. So I think that hopefully proves to be a good upgrade for most people. These are still pulse width modulated style chargers. And so depending on who you talk to, these are certainly very affordable. But if you can spend a little bit more money and get one of those MPPT style chargers, they can manage to harvest and convert a little bit more of the energy into battery charging activity for you.
Question about that, Tom.
Yeah.
I do most of my business with Northern Arizona Wind and Sun, and
Hmm.
they have, depending on who you talk to, different opinions about the PWM versus the MPPT. And with all 12-volt panels, right? So you don't have a 24 or 48 volt panel. With all the panels being 12 volts, they were saying that the PWM is basically this, you don't need the mass or the maximum power point tracking, because you're not converting excess voltage into, increased amperage, because all the panels are the same. And my decision making, just to share real quick, was
Yeah, absolutely.
I put two PWM charge controllers in, so I have 100% redundancy for less than half of what the MPPT charger was going to cost. And I have a MPP charger on a similar military shelter, same solar setup. I don't really see a difference, although I haven't quantified it. Anyway, just so there's some confusion maybe, or difference of opinion on that.
I think there are certainly some people that are overhyping it, and the numbers I've seen is it's 0 to 20% better. But when you say that when you achieve the 20% better, it's under a certain set of circumstances. And then the solar panels themselves are actually putting out, when they start to put out under load, they're more like 18 volts, 19 volts.
Yeah, and almost 20 sometimes.
Yeah.
He also mentioned that some of these panels, like on my camper, I have one in the front and one on each side. So when the sun comes up, it's going to hit the south or the east panel first, oblique on the front, and none on the west if I'm parked south. And an MPP controller has to reach a certain voltage to start charging, right? Where the PWM charger did not have that threshold to start charging. So when you have different panels and different orientations, there was a disadvantage that was explained to me with the MPP charger charge controller.
Yeah, there are a lot of interesting corner cases that each camp will bring up to try to justify, and I don't think it's a big difference. Is kind of my takeaway. Yeah, and then did you wire them in parallel, right?
Yes.
Because
and each panel has its own circuit breaker and wire. So if one gets damaged or torn off, my whole system isn't down.
Yeah. Because there are other interesting debates about, are you better off with parallel or serial wiring? But most of what I hear is that for the smaller setups that most of us are doing, parallel is pretty standard. But so going through what I was considering for the upgrade, and so I labeled this as option skip, but I'm actually going to explain a lot of things I went with. And the only thing I was really skipping here is, I'm not sure if it's redarc or redarc is the way to pronounce that. So the only thing I'm really talking about skipping is this item here. But obviously the first thing was to get myself upgraded to the newer lithium module for the PDI. And with the pendant, I paid $159. That was my cost from getting it direct from them. And as I mentioned before, this was really easy. Pull 4 wires, pull this little screw out. It was real easy to pop out, pop the new one in. The other thing I decided to go with, I just wanted a lot better metering, was the Victron battery monitor. That way I could, it's sitting there keeping a tally of all the amps that are going in and out. So it's giving me a very precise state of charge reading for the batteries. And then I've kind of got mixed feelings now that I'm actually using it. It'll look at your load, and then of course it knows what your state of charge is. It'll give you estimated run times left. I thought that would be really nice to, just see, hey, it looks like the way I'm going right now, I'm good for another 17 hours. But it gets kind of squirrely because it's dependent upon what load you've had on, in the past few minutes when it does the calculation. So
Yeah, squirrely is a good way to identify that.
yeah.
It just changes so much.
Mm-hmm. And then I like the idea of alarms so that if my batteries get down to say 20%, I could have an alarm go off, and I know that I either need to start conserving power or I need to do something to get them charged up.
Is that 20% of, you have a threshold of 20% for them to shut off.
Yes.
So is
So
it 20% above that?
The way I've actually set it up is the alarms go off when it's at 22% stated charge, and then at 20% stated charge, I was cutting off my power loads.
Okay.
And I'll show you in the diagrams how I do that. And it's arbitrary, and I'm going to get out and camp, and I'm going to start to realize that normally I'll figure out how much I typically pull things down, and probably refine my notion of where I want the alarms to go off and where the cutoff should happen. And of course, one thing about a lot of the Victron equipment is you can pull out your cell phone, load an app, and then using a Bluetooth connection, you can tap in and configure the device, and you can also get all sorts of readouts as to, what's the amp flow. And this is an example of, I was down at 12% here, and apparently pulling 3 amps, and it was telling me I had a little over 4 hours of battery left. And it was also in the middle of winter there, so I'm at 2C. That was cold.
Yeah, I like that when I'm driving. I pay attention to the road too.
Ah.
but it connects, and I can see how the lithium batteries are charging.
Yeah.
And should I take the long way to wherever I'm going, or are we done?
That's exactly. So as far as the redarc here, this was one of the chargers I was looking at, and so this takes in the alternator and it takes in solar panels, and it does have optimized an LI, lithium mode setting on it. And the 50 amp charge rate for me, that's in the ballpark of what I was wanting. I didn't see that it had a lot of configurability, and it certainly had no monitoring other than I'm sure it has a few status LEDs on the end of it.
Yeah.
One thing that was cool about this particular unit, as opposed to the Renogy, was that I think they call this their green technology, but they will try to harvest as much solar as they can first, and then they will backfill what's missing from the alternators. So if you're only getting 4 amps of solar and you've got a 50 amp unit, you're only getting 4 amps of solar, it will then go to the alternator to try to get the other 46 amps to get you up to the total of 50 amps. So no matter what your solar input is, it will harvest the rest from the alternator to get you to the 50 amps. And that's a pretty cool feature.
Yeah, you know how the Renogy works?
Yeah, we're going to explain that next. Yeah.
Not quite the same.
And then this particular unit also seemed to be pretty environmentally rugged. So if you have kind of a dirty space that you need to mount it in, it just seemed to be the most environmentally rugged. But ultimately I ended up skipping that. And then here's the Renogy unit. Let's face it, a lot of these things get sold. A lot of people are running on them. A lot of people seem to be fairly happy with them, but there does seem to be a percentage of people that have been raising concerns about them. So it's been a mystery in my mind as to whether to recommend it or not. But specific to to where Joe was going, it's a 50 amp unit, or at least one of the units they sell is a 50 amp unit. But the trick is it handles 50 amps exclusively from the alternator or 50 amps exclusively from solar. But if you have both of these, it basically dedicates 25 amps of capacity over to the alternator and 25 amps of capacity over to the solar, which means if your solar is only putting out 4 amps, well, you're getting 4 plus 25, you're only getting 29 amps through the whole system. So you're losing some potential charging power to your batteries with this Renogy setup. I suspect they were able to make this device a little cheaper by really putting in, my guess is if you tore this box open, you would see 2 25 amp systems. And when both of these, both your alternator and solar are producing, they basically dedicate a 25 amp circuit to each, and that's the way it works. I have heard of people putting a switch on the solar panel.
I did that.
Okay, you did that?
Yep.
So that if you're not getting a lot off your solar, you could just switch off the solar, and that way you're guaranteed to be pulling 50 amps on the alternator line.
Yeah, pretty much it's part of my my setup for departure. You know, it's one of the checklist things is go flip the switch. So.
Oh, okay. So any other comments about the Renogy while we have it up?
Well, just like I said, I thought it was really, really difficult to get any kind of customer support questions. I was on hold once for forever, and they said they were coming back. I sent emails, still nothing. So from a customer service point of view, compared to Victron, it's horrible.
Okay, that's a
So,
bummer.
And I think Mark's point's a good one too, is that, you know, when you see it, it's okay, but you know, it's I don't think you would see it in a real critical environment.
Yeah, it gets the job done for kind of an average camper, I guess. By the way, one thing I did like about this, and I wish, I'm still trying to figure out how to put something into my system to replicate this. It does have a solar to truck battery charging. So I thought that was kind of a cute feature where if your truck battery is dead, you're supposed to be able to have your solar backflowing into your truck batteries. I thought that was a clever feature.
Yeah, I typically disconnect my alternator when I park.
Okay.
So there's a workaround to that with if you're using the 7-pin charging system, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like in my case, or we talked about relays last week, if I turned on my ignition, that would close that relay, and whatever is the highest battery capacity would flow to the lower, like the camper to the truck or vice versa. So you could, I mean, it's nice to have workarounds, right? There's more than one way to accomplish a charging scenario. So if you had good solar in your camper, right, or fully charged batteries and your truck battery is dead, you could just close that, whatever that relay protection is. In my case, it's the ignition. Turn on the ignition and you would be charging the truck batteries. Does that make sense?
Yep.
It does.
Yeah.
Good one. So let me see, anything else about this? And I think you've all read repeatedly, if you're using the Victron battery monitor and it has this big shunt, you want to make sure that the negative here is tied to your batteries, and then all of your negatives for everything else get tied to the other side of the shunt. And that way, all current that's flowing to and from the batteries on the negative side has to flow through this shunt. And that way it could be metered.
Yep.
So this is actually touching on kind of what we were just talking about. There at AM Solar, this has been their primary installation for their customers to date, and a lot of people do this. But it's where you have this voltage sensitive relay basically sitting in the middle. And so instead of a DC to DC charger sitting here, it's basically just a straight shot of fairly heavy wire and then this little relay that can detect, when the truck is not running and the battery voltage is low, it basically disconnects the batteries. But when you start the alternator, the voltage rises. And when there's a surplus of voltage on this side relative to the camper side, then this little circuit basically closes. And they call it a battery combiner because it's literally just parallel connecting the batteries at that point.
Blue Sea also makes a similar but very heavy duty switch that's can be remote controlled and stuff like that, or manual. So you can control it manually. They call it a charging relay.
Yeah, and I think the Battleborn BIM unit, it's kind of a pie-shaped thing. I believe that's just another variant of this, although I think the Battleborn BIM also does some, besides just connecting the wires, if a lot of current is flowing through, it knows how to like disconnect, reconnect as a way of not overloading the alternator. And then if you watch a lot of people wire these up, there is a way to wire it up so that you can press a button somewhere and it will forcibly connect your camper batteries with your truck batteries. And so if your truck batteries happen to go dead, there's this switch sitting under your seat that you could flip and basically force this connection closed and get some charge activity flowing back the other way. At least from my perspective, although I have to appreciate that, installers install a lot of these things and there are a lot of happy people with them. To me, this just kind of struck me as a crude charging mechanism. It's just slamming voltage into the batteries that's not necessarily profiled specific to lithium or AGM or flooded lead acid. So it just seemed like kind of a crude thing. And it doesn't know how to overcome voltage drops, and whereas the DC to DC chargers know how to do that, so they can increase the speed of the charging rate. So I view this as kind of a crude way to set things up. It does work, but it's crude. Was there a comment?
Yeah, it's almost like the old RV. It's a emergency engine start battery connection, right? Yeah.
And I just threw this slide together real quick because I wanted to acknowledge what other people have done with their Northern Lights, and that is they've gone with the Victron MultiPlus. And, this is partly what it means to step up to some of the more serious equipment. I would expect to see this kind of equipment in ambulances, for example, but the nicety of this unit is it gives you a very powerful AC to DC converter, but it also has the DC to AC inverter functionality built into it. And so you're basically getting two pieces of equipment built into one box, and it's highly integrated. And of course, being Victron, you can connect to it with Bluetooth, and you can network it with other chargers so they can kind of compare charging strategies and work those things out.
Yeah, I don't know if I didn't read through it all, but one thing that sold me on that too was the automatic transfer switch is internal. So, when you plug into shore power, that becomes the primary source of power compared to going through your, and then, it starts to charge, but it flips, the AC power out of that. So the MultiPlus is no longer providing the power through the inverter.
Yeah, and that's really nice. And that's where, when I was speccing out a separate inverter, there's this Felix device from Victron that would take shore power and the output of the inverter, and it would try to do that seamless rollover, but it's what, $343 for that little device.
Yeah.
That's the advantage of buying this big box, is that two devices and all of the intelligent connect and rollover logic built into one box.
Now, one thing I do have problems with this, and I don't know if others have seen this, but so the AC part of it, the 60 cycles, the MultiPlus is supposed to synchronize to the shore power. So your 60 cycles, that you're running, when it's pulling it in and then sending it out,
Mhm.
it's supposed to synchronize. However, I find that if I go to shore power where there is a GFCI, it kills the GFCI.
Hmm.
And I haven't gotten a real good answer on that, but it does. Only one, and my one place I went to recently had the GFCI and it didn't trip it, and I thought, I bet you the GFCI is no good.
So out of curiosity, do you have an EMS unit that's confirming the shore power is good in terms of its wiring?
I don't.
Okay.
So yeah, that would be a
So that'd
worthwhile.
be, yeah. Frankly, if I had a tow behind camper that had a lot more room, this is probably the route I would have gone, is the larger multi-plus class device. But one of the concerns I had is as I was scoping out where to install it in the Northern Light. This is a fairly heavy box, and it wasn't clear to me how you could surface mount this on the walls of the Northern Light and not eventually tear out that thin walling. And then you can lay it down, but I think there might be some requirements as to how you can lay it down, because you do need to maintain some ventilation. And
Yeah,
then when I went down to AM Solar to have them scope out, I had them install my solar panels. Figure let someone young crawl around on a freshly waxed roof and not scratch things up. They also were nice to walk into the camper with me. I had pulled the closet floor out. I had the bench seats, plywood pulled out. And so I was able to talk with them about what if I was to install these controllers here. And in a number of cases, and especially with this class of device, they felt there wasn't enough ventilation in some of the crawl spaces.
yeah. Did you see what I did with mine?
I don't think so.
Okay, so I divided that. So I put a platform on top of the battery box with legs that go down to the floor, and so it's sitting on the floor,
Good.
screwed in, but it's kind of against the wall and down to the floor. So that platform is where all of my bus bars are and all of the circuit breakers and any relays that I have. This Victron sits on top of that, and it's attached to the wall. So the majority of the weight is actually on the table, but it's also supported to the wall. But in addition, I put in a piece of 1/2-inch birch plywood on the wall. So I screwed that together, and then I made, so picture now this inverter is subterranean and into the closet. So it's below the closet floor for about 4 or 5 inches, and it's above the closet floor for probably about 16 or so. Okay, then at the closet floor level, I made the floor has a notch in it basically that fits the profile of the inverter. So it's being held in place against the back wall with the floor of the closet. And then I screwed that down. So now the inverter has no real desire to move forward or wiggle on the wall. So it's sitting on the floor and it's pinned up against the wall in the back. And then I have a removable floor in the front that allows me to get to all of the connections and anything else I wanted. So I have posted pictures of it, but it's worked out well. And the advantage I think too is that, and I didn't know all this when I started down the road, but I'm sucking air from underneath in the basement area where there's a lot of air down there, and it's cool, and it pulls the air up into the closet, and then above the top of the closet I cut about a 3.5-inch opening, so it looks like a ceiling vent, or I mean a wall vent up on the top. And what's nice about that is it goes up and then it comes out the closet, and that's where the fantastic fan is.
Oh, okay.
So there's plenty of air coming in from the floor area, going up through the back of the closet and out the ceiling.
I like that. That's good.
Yeah, it's worked out well. It does get warm when it's charging.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be 10 degrees warmer in the closet, but that's about it.
Okay. Well, good deal. Yeah, a lot of people are installing these. Sounds like you're having great success with it. Yeah, I didn't end up going this way, but boy, people should consider this.
Hey, Joe, quick suggestion. Next time you plug in and it trips the GFCI on the shore power
Yep.
receptacle, after that happens and you reset it, just for fun,
Yeah.
if you connected a ground wire from the where all the grounds are attached on the camper at the tie down to something metal that in theory, the GFCI receptacle would also be grounded to.
Okay.
So there's continuity in the ground. See if that would fix the problem.
Yeah, it might. So basically, almost like take a jumper wire to the clamp on the outside of the camper to the box of the, yeah.
Because the GFCI is probably thinking your camper is a device without a ground path.
Yeah, I can do that. I mean, because I can do that at home here. I have a GFCI in my garage that I plug into sometimes. So that would be a good test. Thank you.
Yeah. AC, what a weird. It's hard to understand that AC stuff. So the winner for me was, I've already explained most of this diagram, but it was going with the Sterling DC to DC unit, at least in terms of that alternator path. It seems like there are a lot of Sterling users out there that have been fairly happy. I haven't had to reach out to them for any sort of tech support at this point. And I have heard some concerns about the new Victron 30 amp units getting pretty toasty and then starting to throttle back on the 30 amps in order to not overheat. And I don't know if that's a legit concern, and if Victron's trying to work to get their units to run a little bit cooler, but Sterling's been around for a long time. A lot of people have installed these. With lithium, it's important to get the newer Sterling units. As of the one I bought, it was called the Green Label unit, because that's where they've really added a lot of nice features for lithium. And if you buy your Sterling from Battleborn will make sure that it's the latest Sterling with the latest firmware loaded in it. And their instructions from Battleborn will instruct you on how to program the Sterling correctly. One other thing of note is I did choose to add a battery protect device in my setup. So even though the batteries themselves have the BMS that does a catastrophic battery protect, so if you're drawn down and you're approaching 0%, it will cut things off. I wanted a way to basically kill my loads if things drop down near 20%. So if I'm an idiot when I go hiking and I come back after a long day of hiking and it's dark out, I can always assure myself that maybe I've got 20% left in my batteries by virtue of this other battery protect. Now this battery protect can work by its lonesome and do voltage-based disconnects. And so if let's say the lithium batteries drop down to 12 volts, this thing could cut the loads off. But you can also integrate this in with the Victron battery monitor and its relay that's in there. And so I actually use the relay connection from the battery monitor to the battery protect to do state of charge based cutoffs. And so this is where I can program the battery monitor to give me an alarm at 22% and then flip that relay at 20%. And then that will kill my loads in the camper. And then it was just a natural extension once I had this all connected to also have a simple rocker switch. So, like in European countries, you have that little rocker switch at the front of the house. You can flip that and it'll kill all the loads in the house. And so when I come home for a week and put my camper out in the driveway, I'll flip the little rocker switch to just to make sure all my major loads are turned off at that point.
And that's 100 amp. So is everything going through that in series?
Everything is going through that in series with the exception of the inverter. Victron requests that you don't hook an inverter to one of these load protects because of the startup surge current that inverters can have that could burn this unit out. But the trick is the inverters have a control pin to turn the inverter on and off. And all you do is you take that control pin and you simply connect it to the output of the battery protect. And so when the system is on, when the battery protect is basically on and passing DC power, it's also providing power to that input pin to turn the inverter on. And then when the battery protect turns off and there's 0 volts flowing, that same 0 volt signal then turns the inverter off.
Well, I don't have my settings in front of me, but something tells me that I am shutting off a whole lot less than you are. I'm lower than you are for shut off, and maybe that's not a good thing.
Oh, say more about when you say lower for set off.
I think I'm down closer to 11.8 volts before it shuts off. And I thought it was actually the battery monitoring system in the Battleborns that were doing the shut off on that. I didn't.
Oh.
Yeah, so I mean, this is really good news for me. If this is something the way it should not be driven, then you know, that's a big help to know that.
Okay, yeah.
I can run out and get my manual and see where the stuff is.
Yeah, I thought that the Battleborn should be cutting off at
12.2.
voltage cutoff at 10 volts.
Yeah. So, but that's pretty low, right?
Oh,
it's crazy
yeah,
low.
Yeah, it's crazy low.
Yeah. So I think that's the case, or 10.8 maybe, but it's way less than what way lower than what you're cutting off at. So if that's not a good thing, I'd like to know how to change it. And you're saying I can do that through my BMV 712?
Oh, see, who's doing your cutoff though?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'll disappear for a minute and go get my book that has all that stuff in it. That's all right.
Sure. Let me see. I'm thinking, I'll tell you what, let me just blast a little farther because then we could just open it up.
Okay.
So yeah, my big thing was just adding this additional layer of battery protection where I could set it at a much higher level and just guarantee that when I came back, I'd have some juice left in my batteries. And because I'm using the cell phone app with Bluetooth integration, it made it real easy for me to have multiple profiles on my cell phone for the battery monitor, where the default mode is give me the alarm at 22 and then do the cutoff at 20%. And if I came back, I could easily just bring up the Bluetooth app and I could say, I now authorize you to go down to 5%. And with a click of a button, basically I've reprogrammed that now I can go down to 5% state of charge before this thing kicks off. And then I also have this, actually the battery monitor set up so that the voltage can't go below. I think I had it set at like 11 volts. I figure it's best to shut things down before the batteries feel the need to shut them down. And that way you have 2 layers of protection on your batteries. Battery placement options. I put mine inside just to get that additional warmth. I think you've all read this. One thing I'll point out on this slide is for the high amp line that I'm running into the camper. I've already run the 2-gauge wires. I have yet to actually drill a hole in the side of my camper. It just kind of freaks me out. But I'll be using this Phillips dual pole connector. And one of the things I liked about the Phillips style versus some of the other brands that make a very similar style connector is the Phillips had lugs on the back side. as opposed to you're inserting your wire and crimping it permanently into place. And so when you push this into the side of your camper and then these pop out on the inside, it makes it easy to put wires on, pull wires off. And I think it facilitates getting things connected up, is to have these bolts on the back. And you could also run heavier wires up to the lugs. And then as long as the lugs can fit over these bolts, you could be using larger than the 4-gauge connectors that a lot of other people specify, because the 4-gauge wire in their case has to fit into their opening for their crimping process. This was just a schematic of where I was mounting things. So most everything went behind the rear seat. I put my batteries down near the front, and it's pretty self-explanatory if you go through the slides, how I did all of this. And then I mounted most of my electronics kind of in this rear void area. I had just I do have the shore cable box there, but there was a fair amount of room in here to be mounting stuff. And then I did look at, I considered how much heat each of my devices would be generating. And since the Sterling, I figured, would produce the most heat, I mounted that right up against this wall, because there's a cutout in that wall that leads into kind of the shower stall air area. So that was my way of trying to maximize air circulation between a heat producing device and then a large volume of cold air sitting nearby. I am evacuating the battery compartment completely. And so I'm converting this into storage for wood blocks and floor mats and things like that. One thing I do regret is I've abandoned the master battery switch that's in the back. And instead it's under the bench seat now. There's a big red switch under there, which is the master battery connect. I wish there was a way to use this switch, but I just don't see a way. Any questions on this?
Did you move all of your C1 type 1 connectors or circuit breakers over next to the batteries then?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I can zoom through here. This is detailed wiring if we want to get into it. Let me get to a picture. Yeah, this is the rear bench area. And so that little baby drawer,
Yeah,
that's down on the bottom, that's, I love that little baby drawer. It was my favorite. But
yeah.
I pulled that out, and then it was real easy to unscrew the face of that drawer off from the box. And then just using little wood blocks, I basically have mounted the original drawer front back in place, but now it's fixed. And to this day, I'm still reaching down there expecting to pull out the baby drawer, and now pulling my back out because it doesn't move at all. But for the GC2 style Battleborn batteries, they fit fairly well down in that space. It's a little snug. One regret is I do believe in arcing the cables just so that as the batteries wiggle around, it's not putting undue stress on the mount terminals in the battery. And for the negative one, it turned out that slid right down below the plywood level. And so there wasn't much of an arc in that particular cable. That was my one regret with mounting the batteries in this particular space. But then I mounted my shunt and my negative bus bar in the front area here. And then I'm not sure if we're all this way, but there's this plywood divider. And so I kind of use this as dividing my negative zone from my positive zone. And there's the Sterling charger, my master battery disconnect switch. I mounted my solar charger down low just so that it would be down in the colder air. And then as it generated heat, that would rise up, and hopefully it could rise up enough and then leak out through the cutout by the shower stall wall. But then you can see all my fusing. You know, I was into user interfaces and human factors stuff, so I was really picky about how I laid things out. So it's always the breaker on the left is the power coming in this case from the alternator. And then the breaker on the right is the power coming out of the alternator going to the batteries. And then in the upper corner here, it's a breaker for the solar coming in, and then a breaker for the solar going out to the batteries. And then effectively the same thing for the shore power with the PDI. And then I did need to sneak in one extra breaker because I wanted kind of like an auxiliary power thing. And so I've hung my jacks off this particular breaker here. And I've also added a big red switch right above the controller for the electronic jack so that I could turn those off when I'm not using them from the outside.
I got a question maybe on the breaker.
Yes.
Probably basic. If you look at the breaker itself, like you have a bolt on the top and you have a bolt on the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
The way to wire them, is it like the bottom goes to the batteries and the one on the top, it's your input?
However, you're going to be doing both, right? I mean, I wound up going through the same question on some of these because you wind up sending voltage both ways,
Yeah.
charging and discharging. And so my local auto electric shop guy said, yeah, if you're only going one way, this is the way it should go. And it tells you that on the breaker. But he said they found that it sort of doesn't matter. So I'm hoping he's right.
Yeah, and I did ask about, is there directionality? So must you always have the power coming in on the left and exiting on the right? And at least everyone I talked to said it doesn't. They'll often put the print on there to say, well, in general, you should use the left for the in and the right for the out, but it's
Actually,
there's no electrical requirement.
I think it says battery and load.
Okay.
Being warned about something, that's my alarm, but I have no control over the set point. I have no control over the set point.
So just a comment on the breaker for the solar charge controller.
Yes.
Between the charge controller and the battery, you want to wire that breaker to protect the battery, not the charge controller. And the reason for that is that charge controllers, like anything electronic, can fail and you know, occasionally do. So you want to protect the 200 amps contained in the battery in case something fails in the charge controller and you don't have 200 amps going through that charge controller, which would start a fire.
That's good to know. I hadn't completely thought about that. In general, I've always been told you want fuses between your external power sources and the charge controllers, and then between the charge controllers and the batteries.
Yeah. Yeah, but you want to protect the battery. And so if you wired it the other way and there was a problem with the charge controller, right? I'm trying to figure this out as I speak, but you want to have it absolutely protect the batteries so that there's nothing in the charge controller that could fuse and be a direct short for that 200 amps. So the load side would be the battery, right?
Yeah.
It's actually opposite of how you would regularly install a circuit breaker in this DC circuit, because your load is actually going to be the battery. So you're opening that switch to to protect the battery.
Okay. I guess my understanding is the breakers are, you know, it doesn't matter which way you put the wires. A breaker is a breaker either way.
Yeah.
There isn't directionality.
Well, what I'm relating is the really highly accentuated information on the Morningstar charge controllers.
Okay,
And I think that would be applied to any charge controller,
mhm.
or device. So the 200 amps could easily exceed the 30 amp circuit breaker, right?
Yes.
So anyway, I just thought I would mention that.
No, that's good. I generally look at it as there are wires and you don't want them to fry, and no matter which way the current's flowing, who's trying to harm who, you want to shut that down.
Yeah, if I come across the rationale that they published, I'll send that
Okay.
over. I'll share that.
That would be good. Because I've had the same philosophy about protecting your wires, because that's going to be your fuse. You don't want to melt your wires. So anything in between the two, if you break it, it's broken. So your circuit breaker, as long as it's going to be less than your wire, you should be okay. But if that's not the case, I mean, if what you're saying is that if it becomes a wire and your charge controller shorts and your circuit breaker won't do anything, then yeah, then I can see what you're saying is going to affect it. So yeah, it'd be good to get that information.
Yeah. I'll look for that.
Now you may be touching on another topic, which I wasn't planning on talking about, but it's actually a really good topic. My understanding is the breakers, again, you could go either way. However, the interrupt current rating of breakers is, I can't recall what the interrupt current rating is. So there's basically this idea that, you want a fuse to blow when you exceed a certain current. But if you have a tremendous amount of current running through a fuse and you blow it, the metal in a traditional fuse can kind of blow out, but then it could accidentally reform the connection. So there's this notion of this interrupt current rating that says up through this amount of current, if it blows, it will stay blowing. It won't accidentally reform. And I think with breakers, the concern is that you have metal touching metal. And if you were to have an extremely high current scenario, there would be concerned about the breaker contacts fusing together and failing to release like they normally would. So it'd be interesting to see this paper if they're raising concerns potentially with using breakers in this situation.
I'll see if I can dig that out and share it.
Yeah, and I see that especially with DC, right? That it's not going to go through zero voltage, right. So it's not going to break apart as easily or separate.
So let me touch on one other thing, and then you could just kind of go into question mode, because I have a bunch of slides that show the installation stuff, but I think that's easy enough to do offline. One tricky thing I did do is part of abandoning the battery box is I took note that there was this one problematic wire here that ran over and provided power to the clock and digital TV antenna. And so even though I've done a lot of rewiring over to the panel, I had this little problematic wire. And it's really, in effect, these two wires. And so given that I pulled the battery out of this box, these two wires were no longer running to batteries, but they still had that lingering dependency on them of providing power over here. And so I basically pulled this wire and I ran it to a ground post. And then I pulled this wire and I moved it to one of the unused fuses that was in the distribution panel. And so I basically repurposed these wires into being just device wires that power the clock and digital TV antenna. So that was a little intimidating. And then I guess I didn't really say it, and I should. I removed this jumper inside the PDI. And so I was separating the converter charger section from the DC distribution section. Yeah. And then I was taking that charger output and routing it back through a fuse and into my bus bar. But then independently, as the power was coming out and going to my battery protect, I was then running this to this terminal here so that it could hit the distribution fuses.
Tom, that upgrade that you did to the battery, the problematic battery wires that you referred to,
Uh-huh.
that would be a really simple, obvious upgrade for Northern Light to do. So we didn't have to, access that silly auto resettable
Mhm.
circuit breaker, and we could turn these phantom loads off.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to see him, instead of doing double, triple duty on this one, the bat wires. Yeah, just kind of break this up into multiple wires of heavier gauges. But so let me see, installation. Let me just click through these real quick, and if there's something you see, just yell stop. This was me mounting the battery monitor in the wall. I did drill a hole very carefully, because if you go too far, you go into the shower stall. That would be a bummer. I did drill a big hole just so I could put a pinky around and then twist it around to detect the fact that there are other wires lurking behind this wall. And so as you run your hacksaw blade or a little coping saw blade, you don't want to snag one of those and cut it. Under the bench, mounting of everything.
So just a question. So I have an 8011 on the front right of the dinette over by the bed.
Mhm.
They have a finger hole storage area for that on the floor, but that seat is screwed together. I've never opened it up. Is it worth opening that up? And is there additional storage over there that's worth grabbing?
Are you saying that your front bench seat, you can't open it up?
No, a front bench seat I can. The back one, the one close to the closet where you are there.
Yeah.
That one's closed up, and I've never unscrewed it. So.
Oh yeah, and that's what I did.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let me see if, do I have a good picture of that? Oh yeah, here. So I did unscrew. It was one big panel, and that's where I discovered that I had all of this room in here, and then just below the top shelf there was a couple inches of room to mount the bus bars.
Yeah.
So I found it useful to open it up, and I was able to stuff a lot in there.
Yeah.
And then on the newer Northern Lights, they've apparently taken out the short cord box. And so there's a lot more room under this area that's unused.
They just have a plug now.
Yeah, they have a plug, and I guess you just take the cord and store it elsewhere.
Find some place to put the wire, right?
Yeah. But I mean, that opens up a lot of valuable room, and you can, if I didn't have this box, I probably would have gone for the Victron Multiplus.
Yeah.
And I could have stuffed it in here. And yeah, it's interesting when people post pictures of their campers, how much variability there seems to be in the space that we each are seeing in our units.
I have a 10-2, and that space is huge. And the reason they screwed that plywood down is because they didn't want you to see how poorly utilized it was.
Yeah,
It's great smuggling spot and all kinds of stuff. It's huge, a lot of space there.
Cover it up.
well, they do run these things down from Canada. I wonder. Yeah, well, I did do, I did cut the board in half, and it's hard to see, but I actually mounted a piece of oak just to stiffen this up. And then I did re-screw this down just to add structural stability. And then this other half is the only half that pops out. And, I created the finger hole for that.
Yeah.
And this was just to illustrate that it was really tight in there. So I found myself mounting things to birch plywood panels and then getting most of the wiring done. And then there would be a few pigtails hanging off, and I could install the panel, and then I could just grab that pigtail and drop it onto the bus bar and screw it in. So this was a major trick in terms of being able to mount stuff in really tight spaces. And then this is an example under the front bench seat of the wires coming in. I ended up creating another mounting panel on birch, getting things semi-wired up and then dropping that in and then just putting some screws in there to hold it in place. This is where I plan to have the socket for the high amperage line come in. So again, I just need to have the nerves to drill a big hole through the side of my camper, but it will pop out right here. And I did disconnect the aux 7-pin aux line breaker so that once I activate this style of truck power, I'm not getting anything through the 7-pin in terms of that aux power line. You know, all the other 7-pin connections will still work as is, but it had this little breaker down there, so it made it real nice for pulling the wire off and taping it off. Buzzing through here. This is more details on the rewiring that I did to basically route the converter output directly to the bus bars and the battery, and then through an independent breaker and the battery protect, routing that into the DC fuse panel and routing those out. The lithium upgrade on the module, real easy to pop in. And at least mine had, what was it, a little switch to go between lead acid and lithium, and then kind of a jumper to activate the gel mode when you're in lead mode. But it seems like they've done several revisions of this board. So depending on what you get, it could look a little differently. And then here's what.
Question on the, just go back.
Yes.
So this upgrade, it's like you buy the add-on and you remove the old one and you plug this one.
Yes.
And it's not very complex to do.
No, it's real easy. Matter of fact, let me just, sorry for me jumping around here real quick. Oh, I know I could have found something quicker. Yeah, right here in that whole PDI distribution thing, you know, you pop off the plastic cover, but then it's literally undo 4 wires and then undo this screw, which is holding the module back in place. And then that whole thing just slides out and you just slide your new one in, put the screw back on and make sure you put the 4 wires back in the same place and it all works. And I always recommend taking a picture of the whole setup before you take it out so that once you're trying to put the new one in, if you have questions, you can go back to your old photograph and see what it looked like when the old one was in there. And they look identical.
Okay, I think I'm gonna look for that add-on.
Yeah, it's sold by PD, right?
Yeah, Progressive Dynamics Inc.
Yeah.
Not to be confused with Progressive Industries, whatever, which sells the EMS unit. These guys should have had a meeting of the minds when they started naming their companies to create more distinguished names. And then this is what I did with the old solar charger area. As a matter of fact, there's the old solar charger unit and there's the switch panel. And so for me, I created a button where I can turn my chargers on and off. And I gave it a green light. It's a nice friendly color, and you know, charging is generally a good idea. And then connected to that battery protect unit is the blue switch here. And so I can flip that and that'll turn all my loads off in the camper. And then when I finish installing the inverter, even though the inverter has a standby mode, so if you don't have something plugged into it, it knows how to drop into a standby mode. It's still pulling, you know, it's pulling a few tenths of an amp, even in that standby mode. So I put in a switch so I could turn my inverter off when it's not being used. And then this was just me showing how I was running some of the control lines to the solar charger and to the Stirling unit. And terrifying as this look, I was just using commodity network wiring and just borrowing some of the colors and then twisting together the right colors inside this box. And a lot of the wires aren't used, but it was a way of just using cheap wiring to run my control wires. And then up top, I think I was inspired by one of the other people in Northern Light to go with a slim, a narrow solar panel on the side. And this is from Zamp. And then it turns out Zamp had a stocky solar panel, and so that fit very nicely forward of the fridge or the air conditioner. And then I chose not to mount solar panels up front, though. You absolutely can mount them up there, just because I was worried about going under tree branches and having those whacked off. And then AM Solar has a lot of confidence with this, and I have a lot of confidence in AM Solar. So for the mounting of the panels, it uses L feet, but they're not screwed into the fiberglass. Instead, they're just mounted with the 3M VHB tape and then a little die core around the edges. But on the front, the leading edge of the solar panels, we did use dual feet. And so instead of just 1 foot, 2 feet, they're aimed in different directions. And so that allowed more VHB tape to be used and more die core. And so it just kind of doubled the strength of those leading edge mounts.
So you did not penetrate the ceiling at all, the roof at all?
No,
Well,
at least for mounting the solar panels. AM Solar did mount a combiner box and then drilled a hole through the roof. And you can tell this is the bathroom gray line vent or whatever. And so the wires, the 8-gauge wires were dropped directly down into that rear dinette seat area and directly to the controllers. So this is the one thing that, yeah, I had mixed feelings about it, but on the flip side, if I mount anything else up there, I've got a box that's got this gland ready to go with additional inputs. I did run fresh wires to the fridge in part so they could be behind the battery protect. And then this was an example of up and to the right in the dump compartment, I mounted a big red switch for the jack controller. And so I know to reach up there and flip the switch to turn the jacks on, but hopefully most people wouldn't know to do that from a security perspective. This was the EMS wiring. This was really simple to wire up. It's pretty obvious. And we've already gone over the jack wires. I've got a little thing about crimps and lugs. I tried to standardize on a few wire sizes. And then I also tried to standardize on a few lug sizes, just so that the permutations and combinations of wire sizes and lug hole sizes wasn't too great. And I had a dismal time with this big 16-ton crimper. The crimps just weren't successfully crimping the lugs tight enough. And when you buy these cheap Chinese ones, they don't do American wire gauge. Everything is in terms of millimeters. And so you end up playing around with the different dies, trying to find which die can crimp the American gauge lugs. And so I struggled with this, and I ended up buying a little 10-ton crimper. And it turned out, even though the dies were labeled the same size as the big unit had, their dies were a little tighter. And so I was getting fairly good crimps off of this little 10-ton crimper.
is it a Timco?
No, Temco, that's a nice,
Yeah.
these are the cheap Chinese. This is the one that was doing best for me was this YQK70 unit, which was sold as the U Garden 10 with 9 dies on Amazon. So this was like a $45 unit, and then I think it was like a $65 unit.
Yeah, because I bought a Timco and I thought it was around 85.
Okay.
So not like out of the ballpark. I thought when I first saw it, it was like a $300 or $400 unit.
Yeah, I thought that was a spendier unit, but
Yeah.
and I think that's all I really wanted to go through. So if there's something you want to go back to, or if someone wants to display something else, let's go for it.
I want to go grab my manual, see where my settings are, see where my shutoffs, where the voltage shuts.
Okay,
That'll just take me a couple of seconds to run out to my camper. So I'll see you.
okay.
I need to roll, but I want to thank you, Tom, especially to put all this together and get us talking about it, because this is hard information to come across, especially unique to our campers where nobody knows how they're wired, right?
Mhm.
You should get a medal for that.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. I have fun, but yeah, I want to get some more collaboration going here.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great Sunday.
Hey, we'll see you, Mark.
Thomas, I got maybe a question on the lithium battery, the Battleborn on the sock.
Yes.
Could you go on the matrix you did, that we see the like the voltage and the percentage? Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Oh,
that
this one. Good. Okay.
Yes, yes. So the voltage of the battery of the Battleborn when they are on load, most of the time it's like a 13.2.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. And so if you're at 70% state of charge, but you have about a 10 amp load currently on the line, you're going to be registering about 13.1 volts.
Okay.
And as your load goes up, it'll draw your amp or your voltage down a little lower.
Okay. Now I understand. Okay, perfect. I understand the matrix now. Thank you.
Okay.
And I would say a big thank you, Thomas, for that. Like I said at the beginning, when I purchased that 15,000 camber, I was expecting to have a wiring diagram that I never had.
Yeah.
And just the color of the wiring just made me nuts at the beginning. The white and the black. It's like I think I didn't expect to have that kind of poor quality. I think we could call that a poor quality for the wiring of the Northern Line. Unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, the black and white wiring is real common in the RV and the boating industry. So.
Okay.
And I did on my big diagrams here, I did make this little note that the RV Northern Light wiring colors are this, and the way most of us think is red and black is this. And notice black is negative in one of them and black is positive in the other. And so take care. And somewhere in here, when I did some rewiring, when I did this rewiring here, I actually used some heat shrink tubing on the black wire to put red color coding to remind myself, okay, in this context, this is a positive wire.
That's what I did.
Okay, great. It's maddening. What do you have for us, Joe?
So, merci, Thomas.
Okay, we'll see you.
Can I ask you a question about your battery box when you abandon it?
Yes.
What did you do for insulation? It's quite a heat sink. Did you box it in and spray it, or?
Oh, the battery, I haven't, I'm making sure that all of my new wiring works. And then I'm debating whether I'm going to have the nerves to actually pull the wires out through the box and abandon them on the inside of the camper in that big space. And then I've noticed, at least in mine, I don't feel like there's a lot of insulation down there. So I would like to do something to beef up the insulation.
No, it's just a black plastic box that comes out underneath the sink, and It's got, oh, maybe it's a foot deep and probably about 3 feet in diameter around it. And
Oh, which
It-
model do you have, Bill?
oh, I've got the 10-2.
Ah, the 10-2. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. You know, my battery box is in the very rear,
Oh, okay.
but still, I feel like around that battery box, I'm just seeing some 1/2 inch white foam kind of loosely placed in some of those areas. I'm not even seeing the 1 inch solid core foam placed around those
Mhm.
areas.
Yeah, I pulled the wires through mine to bring them up to the bus bar that's on that floor.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, just very carefully stripped off all of the sealant that they put on there. I don't know what that stuff is. It's really, really hard, but it was okay once you got enough of it to get a grip on it. Then you could peel it off, and the wires came with it,
Mm,
and then they pulled out. And so I mounted them on a bus bar up in the top.
okay.
That worked out well. So, you can't see this. Well, yeah, you could. So if I do that, right, it's probably everything's backwards and upside down or whatever. But this is from the Victron book.
Oh, tell me what page and which book is that?
It's Victron battery monitor, the BMV 712 Smart book.
Ah, okay. Well, let's bring up the real manual then. I just need to jump into my. There it is. Is there a page?
Page 22 and 3. Yeah.
Yeah, let me see. It's the quickest way to get there. Oh,
There you go. Now we're back into English. So it's a little different than mine. 4.1, I'm at 4.2. So go to
okay.
4.2. Yeah, there we are. 22 battery settings, charge voltage. That I keep going.
Okay.
Functions overview. There we go. So is that 4.2? So what I have, it starts out with battery capacity.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, 200 amps. That's where mine's set. Then it's charged voltage. I have 14.4 on that.
I have 13.9. Let me bring up my little, actually, let me dismiss this. I'll bring up a little bit cleaner document. Lithium upgrade, my placard. I need to print this off in PDF for people. For the charge voltage, I have mine set to 13.9.
Okay. So
And-
these were the settings that Battleborn gave me.
Yeah, let me see. Did I capture a Battleborn value? No, I didn't see that.
But you have it set for 13.
Yeah, 13.9, but and that's what AM Solar, both Victron, well, AM Solar was recommending 13.9. Victron had a very interesting article that talked about how for very stable chargers, so like a shore charger that's putting out a constant voltage, you want it to be just 0.2 to 0.3 volts below a float, below your float setting. But that for unstable chargers, so as your solar is fluctuating and going up and down, you wanted 0.2 to 0.3 below the absorb setting. So I think the bigger point, I guess, is there's some good puzzling to be had on this particular setting. There's a reason that you see numbers all over the board.
Okay.
And for some reason, I put a little note to myself. should I bump this up? And I forget what I saw that was suggesting that.
Huh, I wonder if maybe, Battleborn told you to put it at 14.4 and that's why you were questioning it. I don't know, but okay.
Yeah.
So that's the charge voltage, and then the tail current. What do you, they told me to set that at 4%.
Yeah, and I've currently set mine at 3%, and I think I'm still learning about, because your chargers also have a tail current. And so one of the tricks is you want your charger to keep pushing charge into the battery and then cut off when the tail current gets down to a certain amount. But there needs to be some sort of, you want your battery monitor to conclude that the battery has reached a full state of charge, I think just slightly sooner.
So 3 and 4% certainly doesn't seem like it's gonna make a big difference, although the range, yeah, it's the step size, it says is 0.1%, so that could, yeah.
And in this table, you notice I looked at what does Victron recommend, AM Solar and Battleborn. And I'd often play the game of averages here, and I say, some say 4, some say 2. I'm going to set you to 3.
Okay. Yep. All right. And then charge detection time, I have that set at 3 minutes.
I think I have the same, and that is that in the charge detection time, 3 minutes?
Yeah.
And I didn't see any real discussion about how to set that, what it really impacts. And so just, hey, if you say 3, it's good by me.
Yeah. Pugert, I have 1.05 and you have 1.02.
Yeah, and AM Solar says 1.0, and so that's where I landed on 1.02. And there are a lot of people that say this could be set to 1. And do you understand Pugert value?
I don't.
So with lead acid batteries, this comes into play a lot more. Basically, when you start to put a really high load on lead acid batteries, they're inefficient.
Yeah.
At how they discharge. And so some of their energy comes off as heat. In theory, lithium batteries don't really suffer that heat inefficiency. And so you can load them way up and they're not wasting energy and heat. And so that's where you see some people saying, this is effectively, 1.
Okay. The charge efficiency factor,
90.
99. Yeah.
Yep.
And then the current threshold, 1/10 of an amp.
Yeah, and this is one I was talking with Laurent before the meeting started. I'm seeing a situation in my camper where when I turn off all my power and I just have the battery monitor going, that's the only thing that doesn't get cut off, by the way, in my camper, because I didn't want it losing its settings. And it only pulls 0.75 amp hours a month, so it's pretty low. But even when I get everything zeroed out, it'll show 0, but then after a couple of days, it'll start to bounce between 0 and 0.1, and sometimes it'll go as high as 0.15. And that's supposedly just noise. And so this thing is about at what level should you declare it's just noise and you should treat it as a 0.
Okay.
And so I'm going to experiment with bumping mine up, because the problem is if it bumps up to 0.13 right now, then the state of charge calculation, it'll start to pull that out of the state of charge calculation and say that your batteries are draining.
Yeah.
So,
Interesting. Okay, that makes sense. Time to go averaging period, 3 minutes.
yeah, I think I didn't see anyone saying otherwise.
All right, and then that's all I have. The discharge floor, though, I have it 0, which is somewhere, it's not in the printed material here, but it is. You should have a discharge floor somewhere.
I'm trying to recall. I think this low state of charge relay
Yeah.
It's also referred to as the discharge floor. So
And-
depending on which screen you're looking at, it goes by a different name. And, oh wait, maybe it's voltage alarms.
So I can't turn
Yeah.
on my device list because I'm too. It's
Oh,
all-
don't you hate that? I know
Yeah.
I'm not in range, but let me see what the settings were anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, low voltage relay. I had mine set to 11 volts.
Where do you see that on your BMV?
It's under the relay section, and then there's also, and then under the alarm section is the state of charge. Oh wait, it's all under the relay section. Under the relay section, you can specify the cutoff for low voltage and low state of charge. And then I think the low state of charge also gets described as the discharge floor on another of the screens.
So they had me set that at 0. So that meant that it's gonna rely on the BMV the battery management system, the BMS, right, to shut that off.
Correct, and that's a very common recommendation, is let your battery deal with it. But I'm doing this defensive. I want 20% left in the gas tank.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm setting it like that.
And you're doing the 20. You said 20%, but that was low voltage. You have a value for low voltage. That's 11 volts. You turn it off.
So you get to set both low voltage and state of charge. And then if you hit either of those parameters, that's when the relay would turn off. And for me, I just plugged in one low voltage, which was really about defending the battery and just trying to cut things off right before the battle-born cutoff would have occurred. So I set in one value, but then based on, am I in my normal mode, or am I, my power miser mode, where I'm trying to get a few more amp hours out of the battery before I'm dead. That's where I'll play around with the state of charge relay settings.
But okay, so if I'm looking at your list, you have an 11.5 and you have an 11.0. So if you go up to see some settings below, the first value you have is 11.5.
Oh, the 11.5 is apparently when I sound the alarm.
Okay.
And it seemed pretty reasonable on the voltage chart that if you're at 11.5 volts, you're below 9%. You're probably down like 5% of your battery left.
Oh.
And then the 11 volts was, let's go ahead and formally, throw the relay and cut the loads.
Did you ever see the, let me look if I have this. They gave me a voltage and percentage of charge. Did you ever see that?
I don't think so. Do you need me to stop sharing? You want to share something?
Well, let me see if I can find it first. Just to see,
Okay.
signing into. This might work. There we go. Hold on. Yeah, battery discharge. Nope.